When I worked in Charlotte in the 1990s, maybe the thing I most enjoyed about my work was the people. I think that's usually the case when work is satisfying, is because of the people you're working with. One of the aspects of that workplace that was so satisfying was its diversity. I didn't realize at the time how the history of the place, of Charlotte and the region, made that possible. I didn't know anything about the historically black colleges and universities the number of my colleagues had attended. I didn't know how in 1963 hundreds of students from Smith had protested against segregated restaurants and hotels, how several of those activists had had their homes bombed. I don't even think I knew anything about the U.S. Supreme Court case of Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, although it was no doubt on television when I was a very small child, constantly in the late, or rather in the early 70s. In 1971, Swan set the national precedent for use of busing to integrate schools. It was a landmark case, maybe the final major case to desegregate public education in America. In its own way, as important as Brown, and it happened right next door to me. And I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know how several years following that decision, in 1974, students from Charlotte-Mecklenburg invited students from Boston, which was then suffering its much more violent and protracted busing crisis, to come down to Charlotte and see how busing could lead peacefully to the fruits of diversity. Charlotte came to be known as, quote, the city that made desegregation work. One of the fruits of integration, impossible not to recognize, even for someone as dense as me in 1990, was that Charlotte, whose population was 30% African American, had elected its first black mayor, Harvey Gantt, who served 2 terms in the 1980s. Gantt was much beloved in Charlotte. He went on to run twice for the U.S. Senate as Democrat against the segregationist Jesse Helms, who is still infamous for his racist hands-ad and for leading the filibuster on the floor of the Senate to try to oppose the creation of a national holiday to honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because everybody I worked with in 1990, everyone who had expressed an opinion about that Senate race, was voting for Gantt, I was crushed when he lost. I didn't keep up with polls back then. There was a lot I didn't know, including how the tides were already turning against racial integration, those advances so recently won. I had no understanding of how the justices who were appointed to federal benches during the 1980s were case by case reversing the anti-discrimination legislation and court decisions of the 60s and 70s, including that historic 1971 Supreme Court decision on busing that started in Charlotte. On September 9, 1999, 29 years to the day after busing began in Charlotte, federal judge Robert Potter issued the ruling that would end the use of busing in Charlotte to achieve or maintain racial integration. The repercussions in Charlotte, as elsewhere, thorough resegregation of public education, in some cases, hypersegregation. The absence of busing has exacerbated white flight in Charlotte and has become a driving force in the real estate market there. The Reverend John Cleghorn, pastor of Charlotte's Caldwell Presbyterian Church, wrote in a recent op-ed for the Charlotte Observer, Charlotte's retreat from desegregation is notable because at one time we soared higher than any other community, so our plummet is a greater, steeper disappointment. Yes, Charlotte has lost a lot. In 2016, after the lethal police shooting of Keith Lamont Scott, Charlotte became the site of protests and thus part of a national campaign to demand that Black Lives Matter. These are challenging times, and they certainly demonstrate as clearly as ever the timelessness of Dr. King's words, written from a prison cell in Birmingham. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, King wrote. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always right to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity.